My name is Maya Henderson. I was 24 when I found out the truth that would unravel my family, wreck the facade my father spent years perfecting, and light a fire inside me I didn't know I had. It started with a phone call I almost didn't answer. "Hey, kiddo," my dad said, his tone light like he was calling to chat about the weather. "So, listen, there's something I need to tell you." I was standing in my cramped kitchen in Chicago, halfway through reheating some leftover stir-fry after a brutal double shift. My stomach growled, but something in his voice made me pause. "I used some of your trust fund," he said, like he was telling me he borrowed a book. "Just for a little bit. Things have been tight." I blinked. "How much is some, Dad?" Well, all of it, actually. But I had to. It was a necessary move. Investments, a tax situation. You wouldn't understand, but it was critical. You're smart, you'll figure it out." I dropped the fork I was holding. It clattered against the tile, echoing in my silent apartment. "The trust fund Mom left me? For grad school?" I asked, keeping my voice level even though my hands had started to tremble. "Yeah, but come on. Grad school's overrated. You don't need a fancy degree to be successful. And besides, this is just temporary. We're family. We help each other out." That's when I knew. He wasn't sorry. He didn't even think he'd done anything wrong. "Don't tell your grandmother," he added quickly. "She wouldn't understand." No, she wouldn't, because she'd been the one who fought tooth and nail in court to make sure that fund was protected when my mom passed away. She was the only one who stood up to him back then. "I'll figure it out," I said, voice flat. "That's my girl," he said cheerfully. "Knew you'd understand." He hung up before I could say another word. I stood there for a long time, letting the silence wrap around me. Then I sat down, opened my laptop, and got to work. The trust fund had held $68,000, just enough to cover 2 more years of graduate school and living expenses. I'd been frugal, planning every semester like a chess game. I had scholarships and side gigs, but that fund was my safety net. Now it was gone. I started with the bank statements. It took me a few hours to piece together the pattern. Transfers, withdrawals, checks written out to companies I didn't recognize. A lot of them led back to something called Henderson Advisory, a consultancy I'd never heard of. The listed business address? My dad's office. This wasn't a moment of desperation. It was theft. Planned. Calculated. Hidden. I knew I couldn't go to the police, not yet. He was technically the trustee, still had legal authority over the account because I hadn't updated the paperwork after I turned 21. That had been my mistake. I never imagined I'd need to protect myself from my own father. But the bigger mistake? His. He thought I was still the same quiet daughter who never questioned his decisions. The one who forgave him when he missed birthdays or pawned family heirlooms to cover emergencies. The one who smiled politely through years of small betrayals. He didn't know who I'd become, and he was about to find out. I called my grandmother the next day. She answered on the first ring. "Maya? Sweetheart, are you okay? Do you have a minute?" I asked, voice steady. "There's something you need to know." I told her everything, methodically, calmly, like I was presenting a case in court. The bank records, the fund, the lies. She didn't interrupt once. When I finished, there was a long pause. "That man," she said finally, voice trembling with fury. "That man stole your mother's last gift to you." I said nothing, just waited. "I'm calling my attorney," she continued, "and you're flying out here tomorrow. We're going to fix this. Grandma—" "No arguments," she snapped. "You're family. And unlike him, I still know what that means. By the end of the week, I was back in Atlanta, sitting at the long oak table in my grandmother's study with her lawyer, Mrs. Latham, across from me. A tall, no-nonsense woman in her 60s with reading glasses perched on her nose. "We'll start with a formal demand letter," she explained. "We'll outline the unauthorized use of funds, breach of fiduciary duty, and give him a deadline for repayment." "He won't have the money," I said. "Doesn't matter," she replied. "We're establishing a paper trail. And if he doesn't respond?" She smiled. "Then we escalate. Civil court, potential criminal referral, depending on what we find." I didn't ask how likely it was we'd win. I already knew. The paper trail was devastating. His own signatures, transfers to his fake business, notes in his handwriting on checks he'd written to himself. But legal victory wasn't enough. I wanted him to feel it. The humiliation, the exposure, the collapse of the image he'd spent his life curating. He wasn't just a thief. He was a liar, a coward. And I was going to make sure everyone saw it. It didn't take long for the fallout to begin. My grandmother called a family meeting the next weekend. Everyone showed up. My aunt and uncle from Charleston, my cousins from North Carolina, even my dad's older brother, a retired Navy vet who barely left his cabin in Tennessee. But not my father. He wasn't invited. Instead, we read his crimes aloud. I passed around copies of the financial statements. My grandmother handed out folders with summaries prepared by Mrs. Latham. "This is not just about Maya," she said firmly. "This is about a pattern, one that's gone unchecked for too long." My uncle nodded grimly. "He borrowed 15 grand from me last year," he admitted. "Said it was for home repairs. Never saw a dime back." "He told me he'd pay for Bella's braces," my cousin Jenna added, "then ghosted us for 6 months." Each story was a stitch in the same ugly quilt. Lies, manipulation, financial abuse, spanning decades. By the time we finished, there was no doubt this wasn't a one-time lapse. It was who he was, and for the first time, we were going to do something about it. The following Monday, my father received the demand letter. Grandma had it delivered by certified mail, with a receipt signature required. No phone call, no warning, just a thick envelope with his name in bold letters and the evidence of his betrayal inside. I know exactly when he opened it. He called me 20 minutes later. "Maya," he started, trying to keep his voice light. "Got your little letter. You can't be serious." "Oh, I'm very serious," I said, calm as ice. "You stole from me." "I didn't steal. I borrowed. There's a difference." "No, there isn't, and you're going to pay it back. Every dollar. You're letting that old woman poison your mind." "You mean Grandma? The one who actually honors her promises?" He paused. That hit harder than I expected. "I did what I had to do," he finally muttered. "I had business deals in motion, important clients. You funneled my college fund into a fake consulting firm that doesn't even have a website," I cut in. "You didn't invest. You laundered." "Watch your mouth." "Number you watch yours. From now on, any communication goes through our attorney." I hung up without waiting for a reply. The next week was quiet, too quiet. He didn't respond to the demand letter. No email, no phone call, no apology. But he was posting photos on social media. A new watch, dinner at expensive restaurants, a weekend trip to Miami with a woman who looked barely older than me. It was like he was daring me to react. I didn't take the bait. Instead, I built my case. Mrs. Latham helped me request additional financial records. My grandmother made some calls to her friends in the real estate world. We found that Dad had recently refinanced his house on fraudulent income projections. He'd used my trust fund withdrawals to inflate his revenue. It was wire fraud, plain and simple. "He's playing a dangerous game," Mrs. Latham said. "And he's sloppy." "He's arrogant," I corrected. "He doesn't think the rules apply to him." That arrogance was going to be his undoing. I returned to Chicago to finish my final semester, living off emergency grants and a part-time job at a downtown bookstore. Every shift I worked felt like another step away from his shadow. Then one afternoon, I got a message from my cousin Toby. "Hey, your dad's saying you tried to extort him, that you forged those bank records." I stared at the screen, heart thudding. "He said what?" "Told Aunt Jill you were threatening him, that you've always been a manipulator, and this is your revenge for him not paying for your spring break trip years ago." I laughed, out loud, the kind of laugh that comes from pure disbelief. It was happening. He was rewriting the story. Classic Dad. When backed into a corner, he didn't apologize. He invented a new reality where he was the victim. I screenshotted every lie, every accusation. Then I sent the screenshots to Mrs. Latham. "Let him keep talking," she replied. "He's building your case for you." 3 weeks later, we filed. The civil suit named him as a defendant in misappropriation of funds, breach of fiduciary duty, and fraudulent misrepresentation. It was served at his office, in front of his entire staff. He called me within the hour. "Are you insane?" he barked into the phone. "You're suing your own father?" "No," I said. "I'm holding a criminal accountable." "You think this won't follow you around? Employers look into these things. You'll be known as the girl who sued her own blood." "I can live with that," I said. "Can you live with bankruptcy?" Silence. I continued. "You've spent your entire life manipulating people, Dad, but you forgot one thing." "What?" "I keep receipts." Click. He tried everything after that. First came the public smear campaign. He called my university, tried to convince them I was mentally unstable. Claimed I had fabricated the financial records. That backfired. Turns out, my school had already flagged my financial aid file after noticing the sudden disappearance of expected resources. They'd been investigating in parallel, and now that they had documentation from our case, they launched a formal inquiry. Then came the threats, anonymous emails, weird hang-up calls. I suspected he was trying to rattle me. But it only made me more determined. I wasn't the same girl who used to shrink when he raised his voice. That version of me had died the day he emptied my fund. This version? She didn't flinch. At our first court hearing, he showed up in a tailored suit and sunglasses, all smug charm and empty bravado. He tried to approach me before the session began. "Let's just make this go away, Maya," he whispered. "We can settle. Quietly." I didn't even look at him. "You had your chance." When the judge called the session to order, his lawyer stood up first. She looked professional, poised, but when she tried to discredit our evidence, Mrs. Latham calmly tore every argument apart. Emails, texts, copies of bank records, handwritten notes from him acknowledging the money was for Maya's grad school. Even a voicemail where he joked about temporarily rerouting my future. The judge raised an eyebrow. "Mr. Henderson, do you deny making these statements?" His lawyer objected. "Out of context." "Overruled," the judge said. "I've heard enough for today. We'll resume next month." Outside the courtroom, my father didn't say a word. He looked smaller, diminished, like someone who just realized he wasn't the smartest person in the room anymore. I walked past him without breaking stride. That night, my grandmother called. "I'm proud of you," she said simply. "I didn't do it alone," I replied. "No, but you did it bravely." I hung up and sat in the quiet for a while. My life wasn't easy. My finances were tight, my future uncertain. But for the first time in a long time, I felt powerful, because the truth was finally on my side. 3 days after the first hearing, I received an envelope in the mail. No return address. Inside was a printed letter. No signature, just a short typed message. Drop the case. Walk away. Some family matters don't belong in court. Taped to the bottom was a grainy screenshot of a photo from my college days. Me at a party, red cup in hand, mid-laugh. Someone had scribbled, "Is this who you want deciding who's right?" underneath. I read it twice, then again. It wasn't scary, it was desperate. I forwarded it to Mrs. Latham. She called me within minutes. "It's an intimidation tactic," she said, her voice clipped. "He's spiraling." "Should we report it?" "We will, but first, we use it." "How?" "We attach it to the next motion. Pattern of behavior. Retaliation. It's gold." It was hard to explain how good that felt, not because I wanted to hurt him, but because I wanted proof. For years, he'd gaslit everyone in our family, made us question ourselves, downplay his betrayals. Now, every move he made was recorded, time-stamped, submitted as evidence. He was finally being seen. Back in Chicago, things were changing. The bookstore where I worked had offered me a manager role. Small raise, but it gave me stability. And when one of the owners found out about my legal battle, she pulled me aside. "I went through something similar with my dad," she said. "He forged my signature on a loan. I fought it. Won, too. If you ever want to talk—" "I'd love that," I said, genuinely touched. Something was shifting. I was meeting people who understood, who weren't shocked by my story, who didn't ask, "But he's your father. How could you?" They got it. And slowly, I was starting to heal. The second court hearing was brutal. My father had hired a new lawyer. Sharper, meaner. She tried to paint me as unstable, claimed I had a history of anxiety, had struggled with grief after my mother's death, and was lashing out in misplaced anger. It might have worked, if not for one detail. "I have the psychological assessment from my scholarship renewal," I said, handing it to Mrs. Latham. "They did a full evaluation. I'm clean." The judge accepted it without comment. My father's lawyer glared at me like I'd stolen her thunder. Then Mrs. Latham dropped our bomb. She introduced 3 sworn affidavits, one from my aunt, one from a former family accountant, and one from a bank employee who'd witnessed my father making withdrawals while bragging about redirecting funds before the kid blows it on a gender studies degree. The judge looked furious. "Mr. Henderson," he said slowly, "you're aware that misusing fiduciary authority is grounds for both civil and criminal liability?" His lawyer quickly interjected. "Your Honor, we'd like to request mediation before proceeding further." But the damage was done. The room had changed. My father wasn't a concerned parent anymore. He was a liability. Outside the courtroom, reporters were waiting. Word had gotten out. Local media picked up the story after a court clerk leaked documents. They didn't know all the details, but the headlines said enough. "Atlanta woman sues father for stealing education fund." A young reporter asked if I had a comment. I paused, looked into the camera, and said, "You don't get to hurt your children and call it love. Some of us fight back." It went viral that night. That week, 3 more people reached out to me privately. One was a woman who used to work for my father. She told me he'd borrowed money from staff under the guise of investment opportunities. Never repaid a dime. Another was an ex-girlfriend. She said he'd convinced her to co-sign a lease on a luxury car, then stopped paying after a few months, destroyed her credit. The third was a cousin I hadn't spoken to in years. "He told me my college fund was locked in long-term assets," she wrote. "Now I'm wondering if that was a lie." It wasn't just about me anymore. He'd done this to everyone. and I was the first one to fight back. By now, his world was shrinking. His firm lost 2 clients after the news broke. He stopped posting on social media. At the 3rd hearing, he looked tired, angry, and small. My grandmother sat beside me in the courtroom. When the judge asked if we were open to mediation, we agreed, but only under strict conditions: full accounting of all funds, restitution plan, and written admission of wrongdoing. He refused, so we proceeded. That night, I called my mother's old college roommate. I'd found her through an alumni network and reached out weeks ago. She told me my mom had been saving for my education since before I was born. She talked about it all the time, she said. Said if anything ever happened to her, she'd want you to have choices. I hung up and cried harder than I had in months. He hadn't just stolen money. He'd desecrated her legacy. And that was something no settlement could fix. By the time the 4th hearing arrived, my father's lawyer was no longer talking about winning. Now they were begging for a deal. We agreed to a settlement, but not quietly. It required public acknowledgement of what he'd done. It required a structured repayment plan. And it required him to step down from his advisory firm, forever. He tried to argue. Mrs. Latham didn't flinch. No signature, no deal, she said. He signed. When we walked out of the courthouse, the press was waiting again. I didn't stop this time. Just smiled, held my grandmother's hand, and walked toward the cab. He had taken my future, but I had reclaimed my name. A week after the final court hearing, the wire transfer hit my account, the first of many structured repayments. The figure was small compared to what he owed me, but it wasn't about the money anymore. It was about the line in the sand, and he had finally been forced to step back. Mrs. Latham called me that morning. "It's done," she said. "The settlement is now public record. You're officially the legal owner of your mother's original education trust, restructured and protected." I let that sink in. He couldn't touch it anymore. Couldn't borrow, drain, or redirect it. The thing he'd used to control me had become my shield. And the best part, it was mine again. The media storm faded in the weeks that followed, but my story had left a mark. An op-ed I wrote, "The Cost of Betrayal When Parents Break Trust," was picked up by a major online platform. It struck a nerve. Dozens of people reached out, sharing their own stories. Parents who gambled away tuition money, uncles who drained inheritance accounts, grandmothers who left wills only to have them contested by greedy siblings. One woman wrote, "Reading your story gave me the courage to open my own case. Thank you, I'd started a ripple. I hadn't just taken back what was stolen. I'd become the warning sign, the don't mess with her example that others could point to. And that was a kind of power I hadn't expected." My father, meanwhile, went quiet. After resigning from his firm, he tried launching an independent financial advice podcast. It flopped. Sponsors pulled out after background checks. He posted a few vague complaints about cancel culture and family betrayal, but quickly realized no one was buying it. According to court records, he defaulted on his mortgage within 3 months. The house, the same one where I'd grown up, where he'd told me my dreams were expensive hobbies, was foreclosed and sold at auction. Poetic justice, maybe, but all I felt was distance. Like watching someone I used to know drown in the consequences of his own ego. Graduation came on a gray Saturday in May. I wore a deep blue robe, stood in line with students I'd worked beside for years, and smiled through tears when they called my name. Maya Henderson, Masters in Social Policy and Law. My grandmother was in the front row, her white-gloved hands clapping furiously, eyes shining with pride. Afterward, as we stood outside the auditorium, she handed me a small box. It was my mother's pendant, blue sapphire in the shape of a tear. She wanted you to have it on graduation day, Grandma said softly. She'd be so proud. I clutched it to my chest. Thank you, I whispered. I moved to Washington, D.C. that summer to start a fellowship with a nonprofit focused on legal reform for financial abuse victims. It wasn't just a job, it was a mission. I'd lived the consequences. Now I wanted to rewrite the system that let people like my father hide behind outdated guardianship laws and unchecked trust authority. On my second week, I was invited to speak at a summit on financial autonomy. Standing behind the podium, I looked out at the crowd and told them what I'd learned. Sometimes the greatest betrayal comes from the people we're told to trust the most. But survival is not betrayal. Justice is not vengeance. And reclaiming your future is never selfish. Thunderous applause. In the crowd, I saw a young woman wiping tears, and I knew I was exactly where I was meant to be. Of course, my father tried one last time. 6 months into my new role, I received a letter. Not through email, not through legal channels. Just a plain white envelope, handwritten. Maya, I know you probably won't read this, but I need to say it anyway. I'm sorry. I was under pressure. I made decisions I regret. I lost everything. My business, my name, my home. But the thing that hurts the most is losing you. You're my daughter, and I hope someday you'll find it in your heart to forgive me. Dad. I stared at the paper for a long time. It wasn't rage I felt. It wasn't even sadness. It was emptiness. The kind that comes from knowing an apology is just another attempt at redemption without responsibility. I didn't respond. I filed the letter with the rest of the documentation. The evidence. The receipts. Some stories didn't need a sequel. 3 weeks later, my cousin Toby called. Guess what? He said. Dad confronted Uncle Greg at a family gathering, called him out for everything. The room went dead silent. What did Greg say? He stormed out. Typical, I said. Only loud when no one's holding him accountable. Jake's setting up a trust for his kids, Toby added. He told me, I'm doing it right this time. Said he learned from watching you. I smiled. I hadn't just saved myself. I'd changed the playbook for my entire family. That fall, I was invited to a university panel on generational wealth and ethics. When they asked me what the biggest takeaway from my journey was, I didn't hesitate. Don't mistake silence for peace. And don't confuse blood with loyalty. Protect your future, even if it means protecting it from the people who gave you your past. 1 year after the court case ended, I stood in my new apartment in D.C., sipping coffee, the early morning sunlight pouring through the tall windows. The place was modest, but it was mine, paid for by my own income, sustained by work I believed in. That morning, a notice came in my email inbox. Subject: Final payment confirmed. Henderson settlement case number 814-B. I clicked it open. Balance owed, $0.00. Settlement fulfilled. Yes. Status: closed. A rush of feelings hit me. Not joy exactly, not relief either. Something heavier, something permanent. It was over. The debt was paid, but it didn't make things whole. Some scars never fade. Some betrayals never really heal. But I had survived, and I had rebuilt my future brick by brick. Stronger than before, not despite what happened, but because of it. A few days later, I got a call from a woman named Claire Madison. She was a producer with a major documentary network. She'd read my op-ed, seen my panel talks, followed my story quietly over the last year. We're producing a series about financial betrayal in families, she said. We think your story could help a lot of people. I hesitated. I didn't want fame. I didn't want pity. I wanted progress. What's your angle? I asked. Truth, she said simply. And accountability. You didn't just expose your father. You exposed a system that let him do what he did. I agreed on one condition: complete editorial control. She didn't even flinch. The documentary aired 5 months later. Titled Broken Trust: When Bloodlines Blur Boundaries, it included testimony from legal experts, other victims of financial abuse, and, yes, my voice. I sat on camera and told it all. The phone call, the lawsuits, the silence from people who didn't want to take sides. The strength I didn't know I had until I was forced to use it. It wasn't easy, but it mattered. The series went viral. Donations poured in to nonprofits. State lawmakers called for hearings. New legislation was proposed to reform outdated fiduciary laws. One person even emailed me a screenshot of their law school application essay, titled, Inspired by Maya Henderson. That one made me cry. My grandmother flew in to watch the premiere with me. We sat side by side in my living room, wine in hand, the screen glowing in the dark. "You've done good," she said after it ended. "Not just for yourself, for all of us." I nodded. "I just wanted to make it mean something." "You did," she said, "and your mother would be damn proud." As for my father, I heard bits and pieces over time. He tried moving out west, launched a blog claiming to be a victim of family betrayal and toxic inheritance culture. It barely lasted a month. No one took it seriously. When he missed 2 months of rent on his new apartment, his landlord filed eviction paperwork. I saw the court record online. It didn't make me happy. It just made me sad for who he could have been if he'd made different choices. But those weren't my choices to carry. Not anymore. Years passed. I finished my fellowship and was hired full-time by the nonprofit. Eventually, I helped co-author a federal policy proposal on educational trust protections. I traveled, lectured, taught seminars. I became the person my father always feared I'd be: independent, respected, unbreakable, and not once did I owe it to him. Then, one day, a letter arrived. This time from a lawyer, not his. It said my father had passed away. Heart attack, sudden. He had no will, no assets, no estate. But the lawyer had found my name on an old emergency contact list. There was nothing to claim. No inheritance, no debt. Just a single envelope labeled "For Maya," left behind in a lockbox. Inside was a photograph. Me as a baby, asleep on his chest. He was smiling. On the back, he'd written, "I got this one thing right. Didn't I?" I didn't cry. I didn't respond. I folded the photo, placed it in a drawer, and closed it. The past no longer had power over me. Today, my story lives on, not because of who my father was, but because of who I became in spite of him. I no longer live in reaction to his lies. I live in pursuit of truth, of justice, of hope, for every person who's ever been told they're overreacting, ungrateful, or selfish for simply demanding what was already theirs. My name is Maya Henderson, and I turned the worst betrayal of my life into the beginning of everything.